champions of our product said, hey, I love using your product, but the moratorium has come down and I can't use this product. It did happen, and it hurts, right? To know that you now have to break that relationship with that customer. But honestly, more often than not, there was consideration, there was thoughtfulness, there was re-auditing, right? I think as much time and focus as we put into the remediation effort itself, thinking about these forward, some of the points that we just walked through about what we changed about our system. And we did re-audit with customers, and I'm very thankful that a lot of those customers have actually retained their business with us.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source, containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD. That's SNYK.io/TSD. On today's special episode, Guy talks to CodeCov CEO and CTO about the CodeCov breach, a supply chain attack against a code coverage service used by over 1 million developers, in which attackers tampered with CodeCov's client to steal secrets from their customers. CodeCov responded urgently and transparently to the breach, and today Jerrod and Eli describe the attack and their responses, alongside their state of mind and learnings.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we have a very special episode. We're going to dig into the CodeCov breach, which you might have heard of. And we're very fortunate to actually have the people that were able to sort of handle this and willing to share their experience doing it, which are Jerrod Engelberg, who is the CEO of CodeCov, and Eli Hooten, who is the CTO. Eli, Jerrod, thanks for coming onto the show and for kind of willing to share your learnings and the experiences, even if not all of them were sort of maybe the pinnacle of sort of joy as some of this journey.
Absolutely, Guy. Thanks for having us on. Big fan of the podcast, listen to many of the episodes. And if we can help at all, giving some of our learning and knowledge back to the community, I think we've done a good thing here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Guy.
So before we dig in, let's kind of get the listeners educated a little bit about CodeCov in the first place, to kind of set the stage a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about what is CodeCov, what do you do, and maybe a bit about how is it that you integrate into customer environments that kind of sets the stage for what happened?
Sure. I can talk about CodeCov, and then I'll pass over to Eli to talk about how we integrate. So CodeCov fundamentally is a code coverage tool, but really we think of ourselves as helping customers improve systematic testing during the change management process. A lot like, if you all know the product Snyk that Guy has founded, like that, right? We've brought code coverage into the PR or pull request or merge request flow, where we're looking not just at what is your code coverage absolutely, code coverage, a metric of how well tested your code is, but rather how is that testing changing from commit to commit, from PR to PR. And it helps our customers understand at a more fundamental level, hey, am I making my code base, my product, my application more or less well tested as we go? Am I testing the more important parts of my application, et cetera? We're used by over 1 million people. We came from open source roots, but we're also used by large enterprise customers now. I think that gives a pretty good starting point to hand over to Eli to talk about how we integrate.
Yeah, the integration pathway is pretty straightforward when you consider kind of the pantheon of developer tools that are out there today to help customers gain more insights into their code quality and this kind of thing. So generally, as you run your tests, you generate a coverage report. This is a machine readable file that you can then pass along to CodeCov using something we're going to talk about later in great detail, our uploader. Once we receive that report, we process it, give you coverage information. The most logical place to do this handoff of generating the coverage report and passing to CodeCov is in your continuous integration provider. Reason being, you're likely running every commit or majority of your commits through continuous integration, and you're passing those coverage reports to CodeCov. And this gives you a really nice sort of time series history of your code coverage and allows us to tell you things like when code coverage is meeting certain thresholds, it's increasing or decreasing, and we pass this information kind of via CI into the repository provider, so GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, in the form of a status check on a pull request that can tell the reviewer or the engineer, hey, your coverage is too high, your coverage is too low. Use this information to make whatever engineering decision you see fit, but here's what's happening with your code coverage. And that's how we integrate.
Got it. Yeah, thanks both. And clearly, Jerrod, you mentioned 1 million people kind of using it. Those are, almost entirely developers, right? Sort of building it in, making it part of their sort of CI process, and it's kind of a natural build. So it's running and it's executing or sort of collecting data as part of the build process within proximity to the source code and other areas. I guess we'll come back to that. So thanks for the setting the stage here a bit. Let's talk about, the meat of it. So in January of this year, 21, you've had a security breach. Can we just sort of start off by you giving a bit of a description of what is it that has happened?
Yeah, a little context initially is talking about this uploader, right? So in kind of my last answer, I talked about how you send us a machine-readable coverage report using an uploader. Well, what this was at the time of the security incident was a bash script. You would curl that script from our servers. You would pipe it into bash. It would find your coverage reports and it would upload to our servers. Specifically, this is curl pipe to bash, is the way you hear this referred to in the industry. There are a lot of conflicting opinions on curl pipe to bash, a lot of really great things I encourage your listeners to go read about to develop an opinion about curl pipe to bash. But suffice to say, at the time of this incident, that's how our uploader functioned. So this uploader was hosted in a CDN bucket. That was a bucket that was private write, but public read. It needed to be public read so customers could request it and get the actual bash script. The security incident itself, the kind of nature of this attack was that an attacker was able to extract a credential from a compressed layer of our CodeCov Enterprise Docker image that we make available on Docker Hub for our self-hosted on-premises users. They extracted this image. They determined that that image gave them access to this bucket where our bash uploader was stored. And then they were able to use that credential to make alterations to the bash script, potentially malicious alterations. So once they were able to do this, since they could alter the bash script in place in the CDN when it was requested, that altered script could be pulled into a CI pipeline. And that was the sort of fundamental nature of this attack, referred to sort of in the industry as a supply chain attack, right? You have CodeCov in place in your CI, in your supply chain, and an attacker has made a malicious alteration or potentially malicious, and now you are suddenly executing that alteration in your supply chain. So that's the 30,000 foot view of the hack and what happened here.
So this bash script you described, and sort of like, what does it look like? Is it sort of 5 lines of code? Is it 5,000 of them?
Bash scripts can vary pretty wildly. Speaking for this particular bash script, it was quite complex. Reason being, the bash script has been around in CodeCov's history for a long time and has evolved to kind of meet the needs of the customers that pull it down. Over time, it added kind of more and more bells and whistles to work easily in more and more varied workflows. As a result, you end up with a bash script that is quite long, I think several hundred lines of code, or what comprises, and it's all bash, right? And so the script itself was kind of big, kind of involved, had a lot of moving parts. And as a result, I think that it kind of made it easier potentially to change that or alter it in a way that a customer or we might not be able to tell immediately.
Got it. So the attacker manages to sort of get a hold of the credential, which in turn, I guess at that point, the S3 bucket where the uploader script sat down, they have the access, they modify the file, they inject something into that file. I guess from a customer perspective, what did that imply? Like this was the compromise, and you've touched on this, but maybe drilling it a step better. This is how the CodeCov sort of system was compromised, and how the attacker manipulated it. And then on the customer side, can you kind of elaborate a bit more?
Yeah. So what the attacker did essentially was enumerated the environment where the CI was running, basically running an env command, right, to see environment variables printed. The issue that arises is that in some CI pipelines, these environment variables may represent secrets or credentials that access other parts of a company's infrastructure, right? Perhaps maybe for example, there is an environment variable that's a token to access AWS or some kind of infrastructure. Maybe there's a Google Cloud Platform service account credential, right? Or something in there that can then be extracted from the environment and used in a follow-on attack specifically targeted at that company, right? So the env was taken and it was piped to just a third-party server where the attacker could then review later at their leisure. And so how that impacted customers was depending on the configuration of their CI, what they had in their environment, how things were set up, they could have leaked credentials to this attacker.
Got it. Yeah, and these secrets, I guess, they can vary a fair bit, right? Depending on sort of those potential customer systems that would move around.
Of course, if you're an open source library and you're used to your CI being totally open and everything being visible, you may not have anything of consequence in there. There might not really be any real reason to worry about it. If you're in a closed source case, or you're potentially like putting a lot of secrets into your CI, or your CI process is doing a lot of work across your infrastructure or your stack, there could potentially be quite a few sensitive secrets or environment variables there that would be concerning if leaked.
And stealing environment variable may be more or less severe depending on the surrounding, but it's not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not the worst thing that an attacker could have done sort of running in this scenario, is it not? Like, did we just kind of get a little bit lucky that you're sort of stealing environments? Or in theory, the attacker could have also sent like the source code or things like that, or there are other mitigating controls that kept him.
Right. So I'll be very clear that, just for the sake of your listeners, that what happened in our case was enumerating environment variable assumed to a third party. In the grand scheme of things you could do in a CI, if you're executing bash that you've modified in a CI environment, you basically have access to whatever that machine knows, right? So if you've cloned source code onto that machine, it's possible that a script could be written to attempt to find it and extract it, depending on how it's cloned, where it is, what you're doing with it, this kind of thing. So if you're if you're building assets or secondary assets in your CI, they could perhaps be taken. While this is possible, my own opinion is it can be kind of difficult, because what you're having to do is pull things that may be specific to the CI or specific to the company. And at the point that you're making modifications to this bash script, you don't know those things, right? They're specific to the CI configuration themselves. So yes, there's more that could happen, definitely. But in our case, it was the environment variables being curled to a server.
Got it. And I think just to sort of allude to another supply chain security kind of problem that happened around the same time, which was the SolarWinds hack. I guess over there was an actual manipulation of the output of the build system to kind of introduce malware. But fortunately, we didn't have that in this case. So if I backtrack a second there, you mentioned sort of this secret credential that got stolen out of the container image. Is there anything more to share about that? Was that just sort of a local concern?
So the method with which the credential was extracted is perhaps interesting, perhaps unique to us, but may apply to others depending on how they're distributing their software. So CodeCov has an on-premises solution. It's CodeCov Enterprise or CodeCov Self-Hosted. And customers that are interested in running CodeCov in their own infrastructure can use that product. How that product is shipped is a Docker image or a series of Docker images that you then orchestrate together and run in your own infrastructure. These images that are themselves public, you can go to Docker Hub and you can see them, and the customer can pull them easily. This is to make pulling easily from Docker Hub to make sure your infrastructure stays up to date and this kind of thing. So you can pull that image, you can attempt to extract layers, you can use certain tools to look at the intermediate layers of any Docker image. You can attempt to find things that may be in those intermediate layers that you can then exploit. This is actually, I'm venturing a little bit into speculation at this point, but a more common problem than you may think in Docker images themselves. And so if I had any advice for individuals who may be shipping code this way, it's to look at tools like Dive or other kind of layer analysis tools, just to get a really good picture of everything that's happening in their kind of Docker build chain to understand what they're distributing. In this case, the attacker was able to get to a credential by basically going from image to layer to tarball of the layer to decompiling the code that happened to exist in that tarball to then digging in and finding a particular variable of interest. So there were quite a few steps there, but this is a particular line of compromise that could impact anyone that's kind of shipping their software in this way, depending on their sort of Docker image build process and what they're shipping.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, so if I echo back to sort of the sequence here, you have a secret leak at the beginning. So that's sort of one step, I guess, of the element. And then following that, you have the sort of the curl bash, which we can maybe dig a little bit into in a sec, but if you still like that approach or not, but yeah, you have that step later. And subsequently, we have the sort of the environment variable leaks out of it, which I guess isn't a one size fits all, depending. For some customers, that could be disastrous. For others, it might not be that terrible. It's probably never pleasant though, because it's building their system. So almost at a minimum, it would allow some sort of source code access to the platform.
Yeah, I think you have it. I think definitely your summary indicates there's quite a few steps here that you had to go through to get from beginning to end.
Yeah, I think sometimes in the world of security, we get too enamored with sort of the hacker script of, hey, I'm in. And we sort of forget that generally attacks almost always include some form of lateral movement, some form of like sequence of weaknesses that lined up in a row to allow an actual data leak and an actual breach to occur. Well, thanks for this. And I guess maybe we move. So this is the technical. I think it's pretty clear about what was the weakness and what was the chain. Maybe let's kind of shift gears and talk a bit about the process. What happened when this actually occurred in terms of the customers. For starters, I just want to sort of take a moment and pause to say that I really appreciate you sharing kind of all of these details right now. It might feel obvious to sort of people listening to it, but it's really quite uncommon for people to sort of share these details and help others learn from their mistakes. Sometimes it's easier to sort of hide your scars, or those learnings, but we're not going to get better as an industry if you don't do that. So I probably find myself kind of echoing this thanks later on, but it is much appreciated. So I think with that, let's talk a little bit about the timeline of the disclosure. This was the weakness and was the attack. What happened here? Like, how did you discover this, and what's the sort of sequence of events that ensued?
Sure. So as part of our distribution of this bash script, we also include an optional SHA-SUM check or checksum. So when that handshake was not aligned, a customer reported the handshake was off. And that allowed us to understand that this bucket had been compromised. So that was on, believe it or not, April 1st of this year.
Was there ever a moment where you thought someone was pranking you when you got that email?
I did not think there was a prank. I don't know how you felt, Eli.
Not necessarily that it was a prank. It was more, you read that and you think, surely this person's mistaken, right? Like we introduced a change and it just got missed or something. And you, of course, take that email seriously, right? And you dig into kind of what they reported and what they saw. And you just kind of have this growing realization that, oh, wait, something happened here. And so it kind of creeps up on you as you unravel the details, understand what happened.
Yeah, that was certainly an all hands on deck moment for us as a team. We, by that same day, just within a few hours, we had obviously patched Uploader and locked down both our bucket as well as the server where data was being exfilled to. We also, within those first 24, 48 hours, had the forensic firm teams all in place to go do what was a very deep dive. We're a relatively small team to, as well as report to relevant federal authorities around what was going on. And then it was just a effectively dead sprint to get this in front of customers as quickly as we could.
How did you know what to do? Like, you got the report from a customer. How did you figure out that you need to engage a forensic firm and who to reach out to?
I can speak to the first part of that, which is kind of how do you find out, or how do you know what to do? Some of the early steps, the internal steps are fairly obvious, right? A customer is reporting something. This could be a problem. Let's flex our sort of internal muscles here and dig in and see what we know. And I think you either hit one of 2 points. One, oh, this is definitely a problem, and it's time to sound the alarm and reach out in the way we need to, which Jerrod can talk about. Or the second thing hit is, I don't know what this is. And then even in that case, it's time to reach out, sound the alarm, and find somebody. And so I think unless you've definitively shown it's nothing, you can definitively prove that. I think all steps lead to some form of engagement with individuals that are very well versed in this world. And Jerrod can talk about the reach out and how we did that.
Yeah. And I think many people will highlight aspects of, for example, SOC 2 Type 2 and its weaknesses or that type of thing. And I'd like to talk about that later in the podcast. But one thing we had done by requisite policy was actually 2 dry runs. Like, what do we do when this thing happens? How does it work? Who do we reach out to? Where are the phone numbers? What's our cyber insurance policy? And one piece of advice that I'll keep coming back to through this conversation, in case there's any other executives, especially at small companies who maybe are not as well-versed in these types of experiences, is try everything you can to not be flat-footed in the moment that you make this discovery, because then prior to this point, you have time, you can think about things. In this moment, every second, every hour matters a lot. And so we did have to figure out some things on the fly, but there was a few places where we did have some dominoes that were able to start falling very quickly. That helped us a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that the SOC 2 dry run kind of kicked in. I think we often get to sort of think about these things as just a necessary evil to sort of get a sale done and forget, well, there's an actual sort of security value to them. So we'll come back to that. Like, I do think we need to learnings. But coming back to the flow of it. So, you got the disclosure, you dug in, you understood it's a real problem. You knew a few of the steps, like informing the authorities and the forensic firm right away. How did you decide what to do in terms of like outreach, in terms of public disclosure, user communications?
Yeah. So I'll let Eli talk about exactly how we reached our users, but just from an ethical consideration perspective, I will tell you in these moments, you said there's different ways to approach these incidents. And I'd say we've had advisors and counsel in our quarter, and not everyone's going to tell you the same thing. So the only thing that I would say is try to make those ethical considerations prior to these moments as well, right? So one of our core values as a company is transparency, frankly, not just internal transparency, but transparency to our stakeholders. And one thing that was clear, going back to the fact that there were environment variables in play here, we needed affected customers to take action. It wasn't enough just to tell them that this thing had happened as a check the box we disclosed. If there were printed environment variables in the CI environment, we needed customers to roll those variables, right? Or it was like, we very much wanted to work with them to do so. And I think one thing that Eli and I would say to each other at those moments was, if even one customer is not able to hear from us and doesn't take the appropriate action, that's one customer too many, right? And so if we just optimize for the idea of how do we get this information in front of the customer so they can take the action, that was the ethos or the core thesis of how we approached disclosure. And then Eli, I'll let you talk about how we actually went about doing that.
Yeah. Before I get into that, I want to echo Jerrod's point about following your ethics and having these strong values. I think you'll know you're doing it right when the answer is obvious, even if the way ahead is painful or difficult, right? You know what you have to do. That decision was made long before a security incident. You just have to march forward and do it. And I think in that respect, CodeCov was in a very good place. Now, how we went about reach out, it was kind of unique to CodeCov in the way it works. Since you sign in through kind of a social sign-in or OAuth through GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, in those platforms, you can opt to not share your email via those authentication mechanisms or authorization mechanisms. And so for a lot of our users, or for some number of our users, we may not have even had their email. And so we can't just email blast everybody. So we had to really tackle it on all fronts. So every email we had of impacted users, we emailed. We had public disclosures that we promoted, tried to point everybody to, tried to really make announcements out of this. The sort of tech reporting media helped here by sort of signal boosting that stuff and getting more people to see it. The other thing we did is just dumped notifications in application. If you log into CodeCov, you're going to see this was a problem and you need to be directed to this disclosure and you need to know what to do next. And so it wasn't a question about how bad is this going to hurt? How embarrassing is this going to be to tell all our users this happened? It's like, no, we're doing it. And by any means necessary, we're going to do our level best to reach every single customer we can. So that's what we did.
That's laudable and I think very much the case. And I guess it's worth also highlighting that you knew that their information was being leaked, right? It wasn't a weakness, it wasn't a vulnerability, it was a breach that you've sort of seen the line. So you don't know what the attacker did with those environment variables, but the environment variables were sent out. So I think definitely the right move to do it. Were there, I guess, kind of voices in the room, and not to sort of, point any fingers, but like, was there a lot of pull? I'd imagine like on the legal side or such, there must be some temptation to say, no, let's like not take any accountability, right? Or sort of, like not admit failure almost. Did that happen here? Did you have to resist that pull? You talk about your sort of ethics, it sounds like, as opposed to some other sort of pull or desire.
Without pointing fingers in any way, there were times where we received some amount of counsel to at least consider not going public. So I'm not saying it was necessarily even bad counsel per se, but just be aware that if and when you go through this, you probably will either feel something internally pulling you that way or something externally. So that's why I say try to make that decision ahead of time, what you're going to do, because it's much hairier in the moment to think through that.
When the emotions are running high.
Sure. My perspective as we were going through that, I'll go back to the strong ethics, because when you're in the room, there are people who perfectly well-meaning stakeholders who are very interested in trying to make sure that the company comes to this in the best way possible, right? And so they may have some opinion or input that might run counter to your values or your ethics as a company. And so once again, if you have those strong ethics, you can enter those conversations and say, look, this is the way we're doing it. How do we do it in the way that best suits the company? How do we do it in the way that's best for us and our users? But according to our values, this is the way we have to approach this. And it takes all that contention sort of off the table. It becomes more of a question of how do we solve this problem? How do we communicate this way instead of should we communicate this way? And I think that's a much easier problem to solve.
To add one more thing, you brought up the legal framework. I actually do feel fairly lucky to exist in a Western legal framework where, according to our lawyers and I think many others, disclosure is a strong legal standing, right? Like it actually helps, right? I think where I've seen massive blowback against incidents in the public eye, and additionally, it seems to be when people try to sweep something under the rug, right? And yeah, maybe you get very lucky and no one ever finds out, but it's just a really strange way to approach this collective thing that we're all building in the open internet.
That's definitely good. And I would say legislation is probably headed that way more and more, right? With GDPR and sort of extreme penalties on it. I think you're spot on, Jerrod, sort of saying, you have to sort of exercise this a little bit or have conversations about how you will react without the emotions running high. But I guess as one aspect of it, was it to sort of stick to the facts, ensure you sort of disclose things, but try to sort of avoid any opinions or statements of that and sort of be very factual? Is that an element of such a disclosure?
Yeah, I look at some other breach disclosures from history, and I think developers and security folks and secure developers collectively can very much sniff out PR talk, right? Press talk. And there is a connection that you draw with your user when you are quite direct, literal. Don't try to paper over the facts. Give them what they need as quickly as possible. And we tried to aspire for that, and we were inspired on that by some other breaches that we looked at and we're like, wow, that's a great way to word that. I feel like the person who wrote that disclosure understands me as a developer, not me as a press person or something like that.
So we're going to get a little bit into like remedial actions around sort of learnings and making the system more resilient. But maybe before we do that, just talk a little bit about the sort of the emotions in the moment. So, I mean, this is not the best moment of your lives, probably. Anything to share? Like, I guess, how does it feel to do this? And maybe what helped in terms of not getting sucked into the bummed out sensation, but sort of, push forward?
The first step is to sit with it. You may not know how it happened. You may not know the pathway. That's a hard problem to solve. You have to figure it out. But once you understand the impact, I think it's okay to sit with it and get sucked into that for a little bit, right? And just give yourself space to feel very bad about that. And then you get to work. Yeah, there's dread. Yeah, there's stress. There's also this underlying current of having to solve a very, very challenging technical problem to figure out how this happened. Earlier in this conversation, we talked about all the steps it took to get to where this attack was successful for the attacker, right? And none of that was free. None of that was given to us, right? We just saw the end result and had to work backwards and fill in every piece of the blanks. And it was difficult and challenging. And you fill with thread, you're moving as fast as you can because you're thinking about your customers. So you just do your best to balance that. For me, it was sitting with it in the beginning. Hey, this was bad. Okay, let's move on. Let's try to solve it. And then you just move forward and solve the problem. But yeah, it's incredibly challenging in the moment.
The other thing that was always powering me through those hardest moments, two things. One was the fact that, yes, I got into this industry, started working on CodeCov to make CodeCov successful, but also really because I wanted to make this industry successful, right? I thought there was an edge or an opening to build this product that can be widely used and loved. And so if you channel that thought process, then the best thing that you can do for that same industry that you love, for the same developers that you try to serve, is just kind of step forward fearlessly, right? And so that definitely helped me power through those moments. The other thing I would call out is there's humans on both sides of this equation, right? Yes, there's legal corporations and all these things that govern these relationships, but every time you'd get on a call with one of these customers, the human empathy that was there, person to person, was extremely helpful. And I think the security professionals at large deserve a lot of thanks, at least for me. I saw some really thoughtful, helpful advice from massive companies. I can't name names, but you know who you are if you're listening. And the fact that they also saw the bigger picture, right? Even I saw security professionals working together on this that were direct competitors, right? Where their companies would never be working together, but these security professionals that are in each of those respective corporations are able to really collaborate in a way that I thought was very, very cool. And so those two pieces really, I think, helped with the emotional kind of, as you guys said, dread of, hey, like this hurts, right? This hurts on both sides.
Yeah, it's great to see growing empathy indeed in the sort of the security and I guess tech scene as a whole. And I think there were both good tips on how to cope with the moment. So let's maybe sort of switch to the rise after. So maybe starting kind of more tactically. So what have you changed or sort of applied from a security perspective in CodeCov post breach?
Sure. So we immediately, in terms of remediation, like revoke the credential, find any other evidence of credentials they could accidentally get into source code or whatever. All that's removed and gone. The next step is you immediately put active monitoring on the sort of bucket holding your bash uploader, such that if there's any change, you're getting an alert. And you can look at that alert and go, oh yeah, we made that change. Or, oh, what is this? So kind of that was sort of table stakes kind of stuff to do immediately after this happened. In the longer term, we took a look at the bash uploader, and it had actually been on our agenda for a long time to replace it for reasons that aren't even necessarily inherent to security. For example, bash is kind of tough to maintain. It's hard to test. It's hard to modularize. There are just a lot of issues with working with bash generally that a modern language would help overcome. And so we were already undergoing efforts to kind of rewrite this bash uploader in a more modern language. It was kind of easier to test, easier to take contributions on, and this kind of thing. So we expedited that work to get it across the finish line even faster. We ended up changing the mechanism of distribution from curl pipe to bash to using sort of a compiled binary that we could distribute that was signed and SHA-SON verified and all this, so that you could be much more certain of the integrity of what you were pulling from us if you chose to do it. We could have done that with bash as well. In fact, the bash had a checksum. It didn't have kind of signature verification, but we could have added those pieces. The reason we chose to go with a new uploader anyway is we were already writing that and doing that work. So we put those security pieces there. And we've also started a 12-month deprecation window for the bash uploader and are actively in the process of moving our customers from bash to this new uploader as well.
I guess a couple of questions on those. One is, how much do you attribute to bash? I mean, does it really matter if this was bash or some other tool that was included in it?
I think there's generally a pretty negative stigma around curl pipe to bash. I think earlier in this conversation, I mentioned that listeners could Google it and read about it and understand the problems. Those problems are overcomable, or at least partially overcomable, with things like SHA-SON verification or having a signature to verify that, oh, hey, it was CodeCov signed this, and so I know it's their change and this kind of thing. Is that enough to overcome a curl pipe to bash stigma? For some people, maybe. For some people, may not. I think in our case, the move away from bash, like I mentioned, was already happening. Like we had already decided there were problems here, and not even just security problems, but problems from like a modern software development aspect that just made it challenging to work on. And so moving to a new language, in our case, we're kind of building this off Nodejs.
That was precisely my next question, which is like, what language did you sort of choose?
Yeah. So we chose Node. There were some business reasons for that as well. I can get into if you're curious, but we ended up choosing Node. That was more a consequence of it's just really hard to work on bash in kind of the team setting, and layering on the security pieces. We could have easily done to bash, but we chose to do the new uploader and push that out and move everyone towards that.
And the mode, if I think about this from a customer side, I mean, fine, you wrote the relevant functionality in Node.js as opposed to in bash, but that also implies users consume it in a different fashion, right? They don't curl into Node.js script, they in another fashion.
Yeah, we actually distribute this as binaries for all the major CI platforms. So if you're building a Mac OS, if you're building a Windows, Linux, Alpine, we have a kind of a Node binary that you can wget and pull into your CI. And then as we go to our documentation and we encourage our users, you can SHA-SON check this for its integrity. You can signature verify it to make sure that we provided it. And then you kind of use it with an interface very similar to the bash uploader. So after you bring it in and verify it, the actual use is fairly similar at the end of the day.
Yeah. And how do you get users to actually apply that checksum? So you're, fundamentally, you can wget without doing checksum verification as well. And that binary can also be tampered with. It's a bit harder than bash, but it can also be tampered with. How do you get users to actually, run the right line?
Yeah, of course. So ultimately, it becomes an education problem, right? I can't step into your CI and write these lines of code for you to do the verification or this kind of thing. So in our public documentation, kind of where we provide the new uploader and talk about it immediately on that page is, hey, here's how you verify, here's how you SHA-SON check. This is exactly how you should do it. We highly recommend you do it. But at the end of the day, I can't make you. And so if a customer chooses not to, there's not a lot we can do.
However, whenever we can wrap our own uploader, so for example, like GitHub Actions, Circle CI orbs, then we can actually add these things out of the box for the user as well. But make no mistake, Guy, our industry has a distribution problem, right? Until this is zero trust, I don't want to step on a future question, but until this is zero trust, it's like there is always this handshake, right? And we can make the handshake more and more sophisticated, but it's definitely something that I think a lot about as we move forward and what can come next.
Yeah, to echo that, in the parts of the distribution of the uploader we can control, specifically our GitHub action, our Circle CI orb, and our Bitrise step, we do the SHA-SUM checking and the signing of the binary uploader that those things pull in before customers use them. So in those cases, we do control it and ensure it happens. But if you're bringing down the uploader yourself, like in your own CI, it falls onto an education problem for us to make sure that you know you can do these things and why you should do them.
So we talked about sort of the actions, the immediate kind of monitoring actions, sort of remove the secrets, sort of the change the bash uploader to an Node.js. Any other sort of notable technical learning, I guess, or sort of, tools added?
Yeah, there's the Docker side of this, right? Ultimately what kicked this off was the ability to find something meaningful in a Docker layer. So Docker has some experimental support for squashing that may become kind of more in the mainline release. So you can flatten your Docker image and not have those intermediate layers. That's one thing. We did that. We also moved to multi-stage builds such that kind of like all your source used to build what you're packaging into the image is in one layer, but what you're distributing is a secondary image that just contains kind of your built binary. The other thing we did is we forked a project called Dive, which is a very great open source project that can sort of programmatically explore Docker images for these layers. We forked it and specifically added rules to make sure that artifacts that are very commonly in our source code and should be there aren't present in the built image. And so that's one final thing that we worked into our CI, such that whenever we want to push a new release of self-hosted out, that check has to pass and we know there's nothing present that an attacker can potentially use.
And then speaking to the compliance or SOC 2 policy type side of this, one, key generation and rotation, we actually built our own in-house key management solution, more than what you get from like a vault. Like, what is the metadata around this key? What's it used for? When was it recently generated? When should we regenerate it next? Right, to just keep those tokens cycling fresh. Two is, yes, I said there were some things that we had momentum on, we had practiced on for an incident like this, but there were some that we had not, right? And I think learning from these points of the process where it's like, we could have been more prepared X, Y, or Z place, right? And actually recording those and writing those in. And lastly, staffing changes, just really building our dedicated security muscle here, even as a small company, because we are widely used, right? Like, we need to respect the role that we have in our industry and software supply chain. The last thing I'd say about SOC 2 is it's kind of like a gym, like a fitness routine. Like, it's only as good as you actually make the routine. Yeah, you can go to the gym twice a week and you can go for a run, but really only you know your body. And I think some of the tweaks that we made were very specific to CodeCov, and I felt really good to level up how we test ourselves, right? Beyond what is the bare minimum.
Yeah, definitely kind of great to sort of apply the practice. And I can kind of hear you loud and clear and fully agreed, which is indeed, we tend to park outside again to do the minimum, when it comes to some of these regulations and SOC 2 included. And boy, can they come in handy, at a at a time of need. So yeah, definitely understood. Cool. Well, these are all really kind of good learning. Sounds like, from a company culture and kind of the fire drills and learnings around it, from the technical system, I would even sort of put the key rotation kind of is in that bucket, although it is about maybe just sort of cleaning the house regularly. And Eli, everything you described around sort of the pipeline security components and then the users. How about the business side of this activity? So I guess maybe we start like just asking in general, like, how did this affect, everything we focused on sort of the security, so securing the users? If I'm asked, like, what was the impact on CodeCov's business of, for starters, the bridge, and then also your response to it?
I would be lying if I said there weren't some customers that said, hey, we can't use you at this time. Or champions of our product said, hey, I love using your product, but the moratorium has come down and I can't use this product. It did happen, and it hurts, right? To know that you now have to break that relationship with that customer. But honestly, more often than not, there was consideration, there was thoughtfulness, there was re-auditing, right? I think as much time and focus as we put into the remediation effort itself, thinking about these forward some of the points that we just walked through about what we changed about our system. And we did re-audit with customers. And I'm very thankful that a lot of those customers have actually retained their business with us, right? And I think if we weren't transparent, if we weren't very forthright with where this came, and those customers found out, like the chance of retaining them, I think starts to converge towards zero very quickly, right? I think going back to that human element, most people understand that most companies will go through some sort of severe vulnerability or breach at some point. Doesn't make it feel any better in the moment. And I definitely feel like we cut ours relatively early in the life cycle of our business. But from a customer relationship perspective, I'm very grateful, frankly, that people gave us a chance and were at least willing to look at CodeCov with fresh eyes and say, hey, if we were looking at this business for the first time, based on all the controls that they have, the things that they put into place, where would we land on a security audit versus, hey, they had an incident, therefore we're out. Again, I'm not blaming someone for feeling that way, but it was cool. And I think very first principles oriented, I guess you'd say, that people kind of look at this with fresh eyes and say, hey, is this a security approach and measurement that we can sign up for?
Yeah. It's great to hear that understanding, and I do think that I must imagine that your transparent handling of it has played a big role in that approach. I have like a bunch more questions, but I think we're sort of getting a bit tight on time. We've already kind of been going a bit long. Maybe we'll sort of shift a little bit to like a straight education phase. I think you've gone through this process and learned from it. Would love to maybe spend the next sort of few minutes talking a little bit about some advice and maybe then kind of level up a bit to the industry level and indeed talk about, what should we do there? But for starters, you gave a bunch of good advice here already around how you handled it that people can learn from. But straight up, if you're talking to a fellow CEO, CTO of a company, what would your primary advice be, having experienced what you did?
One of the most important things I learned from this process, and we've talked about it a bit, is that your most important tool in this process, in my opinion, is people. Lean on your network, lean on your team, lean on individuals that are legitimately interested in creating a more secure sort of software ecosystem, right? Jerrod mentioned earlier on in this conversation that he had instances of security teams who may be on direct competitors, like working together, right, to try to help solve these problems, understand what's happening. And I think that's just a great story for how the human side of security works. Everyone legitimately wants to help you. No one wants these problems to exist. No one wants companies or people to be dramatically impacted by things like this. So don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to have honest conversations with people that can work hard to help you. And that applies both externally and internally. One of the things that we had to do inside the team was kind of split focus, right? I mentioned earlier that this was a hard problem, like figuring out how all this happened on the technical side was very difficult. And so we immediately split the team and said, hey, half of us are going to work on this. Everybody else, you got to keep the business running forward. Like you've got to keep kind of doing the day-to-day and getting things across the finish line. And having that trust internally, I think, is what helped us to have the outcome we did. And then having the trust externally with other individuals in the security space to give us good advice, to be helpful, to do their best to make sure we were successful. We couldn't have gotten to where we were without it. And so if anything, trust people. They'll help you in this case.
My advice for a CEO or CTO going through this, especially one who's at the earlier stage of growth of their company, look, you may not have a CISO or some super senior security professional on your team that's going to be the champion of this. And like with all hard problems in a business, it ends up falling to the executives, right? If no one else can take it. So first of all, just internalize the fact that this is going to be on your shoulders, right? And that's okay. But knowing that will happen, what is everything that you can have in place ahead of time? Knowing that, again, I'm sorry to tell you, but most companies will go through something of some type, severe vulnerability incident. And so just thinking about, hey, in that eventuality, who's the first phone call I'm going to make? Sure, maybe I don't have a CISO, but maybe I have a great security advisor, right, who's gone through it. I don't want to name names because we haven't announced this investment yet, but we have some great security folks on our cap table that honestly made a huge difference. It took days to hours and making the right contacts, getting the right advice, jumping through some of these things. So knowing who your first phone call is, knowing what that process is, having the cyber insurance policy in place, please do it for so many reasons. That's everything before. And then in that moment, stick to your guns, think about the reasons that you're doing what you're doing, stay super customer centric, because I think the best thing that you can do for the longevity of your business is just keep your customers absolutely front of mind. And then coming out of the event, ask a ton of questions. I mean, a lot of the changes that we made to our systems, yes, we had some good ideas, but we also talked to a ton of customers and said, hey, what do you want to see here? How would you want us to bounce back from this? Where were your concerns? Some amazing, very senior security folks at large companies give us great feedback on our actual postmortem and how we're changing things. Hey, that's great, but have you thought about X, right? And so you're just not going to know all of this in one go. And so kind of finding that advice and counsel all the way through and being very humble in that discovery process and truth seeking, I think really is what got us through here.
I think all very sound advice, and I guess it all comes back to like, don't try to sweep it under the rug. It's if you actually sort of engage and you trust and you open up, you'll reach a better outcome. So talking a bit industry wide here, Jerrod, you were talking about sort of the industry has a bit of a distribution problem, or maybe not a bit. I guess, how do we think about these types of, I would sort of say CodeCov is, it's a great tool, a great solution. It's used very, very broadly. And probably like a big part of the sort of maybe waves or news that it made, were related to the prevalence. I think that's also true for like Heartbleed and the likes. Yes, the vulnerabilities or the breaches themselves, are noteworthy, but also just the sort of widespread nature of the solutions. I don't know if you sort of agree with that or not, but like, how do we tackle this as an industry? How do we get better? What are our problems and maybe what are good actions we should do?
I do believe that in a zero trust future for our industry, I believe that we will find a way to get there, or at least very proximate to zero trust, because we've taken the steps, we've shown the IDs, we've taken the phone calls, right, to try to prove we are who we are, and all the things that happen within that. And we're close to now projects like Sigstore that I think is really promising. Eli can talk more about that. But fundamentally, I'm a huge believer still in open source software. I'm guessing that's part of the reason that you do what you do as well, Guy. And I think it's been a huge driver, this open source movement, the dependencies that we have all around us in this huge innovation curve that we've experienced over the last few decades. And so instead of trying to turn our backs on that and becoming insular, the question is, how can we, in a maximally safe way, interact with one another, right? Often, I think, probably in the open, right? That can shine these lights.
Can you actually say a few more words about Sigstore? I'm familiar with it, but not everybody is. Can you say a few words about that?
So one of the things we asked ourselves after this happened is, how can we ensure kind of the integrity and safety of what we're contributing to the supply chain, right? In this case, kind of the CodeCov bash uploader. So we looked around for solutions. We ended up settling with kind of SHA, checking and signing, like I talked about. But there is an emerging project called Sigstore. Has a lot of industry backers, and its specific purpose is to code sign the things that you're sort of shipping and kind of verify the things that you're contributing to the supply chain. It does this through the use of a kind of a public open ledger. I'm really hand waving it to kind of get it across to your listeners, but there's a sort of study of a public open ledger that basically you could use to say, hey, CodeCov did the latest change to the uploader at this time. Here's proof that it was them that did it. And this is just publicly viewable and verifiable by anyone. And then the second piece would kind of be around that sort of code verification that, hey, here's a SHA or some calculated digest that tells us this is exactly what CodeCov meant to distribute. So they distributed it, and what you're receiving is what they distributed. It's similar to what kind of we did in more bespoke fashion and what you see other companies do that operate in the space. I think Sigstore is moving to make that sort of more official, more standardized, more accessible. And I think all those things are good. And so entrants like Sigstore, others that are trying to solve this problem, I think are great for helping to ensure the integrity of the supply chain. And that kind of solves sort of one side of the problem, which is the individuals or companies placing things into the supply chain for you to use are taking these steps to make sure that what they're placing there is kind of what they say it is. The other side of this is the sort of consumer themselves. If I'm building a CI pipeline, if I'm cobbling these tools together to solve some problem for me, I need to understand what I'm using. I should verify. I should go through the steps they provide to make sure these things are verified and correct. I should probably audit what I'm bringing in to make sure that, hey, is this dependency worth it for my organization, for this project, et cetera? And I think we're only going to solve this problem if it occurs in a two-sided fashion, right? Where those that are contributing are providing ways to verify the integrity of what they're doing, and the consumers of these things are ensuring that the integrity is there, right? They're doing the verification. I think making those steps helps get us to the zero trust future that Jerrod mentioned. And I think with time, we can make it there. And that would be a net benefit for everyone operating in this space.
That's great advice, and actually a great note to maybe end our episode on. Jerrod, great job actually reacting to the breach and being transparent about it and helping users actually overcome it. And again, just a big thanks for sharing the story and being transparent about it and helping all of us learn from it. So, when inevitably or, at least high probability, more people find themselves in this situation, they're a bit better equipped at handling it. So thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you found this educational and helpful, and I hope you don't find that you need it soon. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.